Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. I'm Suzanne Atwell. Our focus for this program, red tide. We'll hear from Mote Marine, the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, the latest marketing plans from Visit Sarasota County, and a passionate call to action from a well-known restaurateur and social activist. But first, some background. The current outbreak is one of the worst in modern times. Florida Fish and Wildlife reports that 180 red tide-related manatee deaths through October, and the number is expected to rise. Between July and October, 66 dead dolphins stranded on the southwest coast of Florida. Statewide, sea turtle mortalities through October, 2,338, the worst in decades. Countless dead fish covered the state's beaches. The long-term impact on marine reproduction and population is unknown. The timeline for this outbreak goes back well over a year. Mote Marine announced the creation of a multi-million-dollar Red Tide Institute funded by private and Florida Fish and Wildlife donations. And in a rare bipartisan vote in Washington, a Water Infrastructure Act was passed which authorizes $1.3 billion for the Florida Everglades Reservoir. We recently sat down with Mote Marine's senior research scientist to learn more about red tide, what happened, why, and what can be done. Welcome, Dr. Pierce. It's great to have you. I'm going to start out with a general question on red tide. This year, the severity, what happened? Why was it so severe?
It seems about every 5 to 7 years we have a very intensive period of red tide. Why that happens, that's one of the things that we're actually trying to figure out with the data that we obtain. We really need more frequent and more consistent data in order to answer questions like that. So that's part of the upgrade in the funding that's coming down the line, is to be able to get that type of information, get the consistent long-term funding and almost 24/7 analyses so that we can answer what's happening right now instead of going out in the ship once a month, taking samples, bring them back, analyze them. Then we know what was there when we were out there, but we don't know what's going on all the time. So to answer that type of questions, that's what we need to do, and we're working towards that.
Right, keep it in focus here. That has to be a consistent, that it wasn't in the past.
That's correct.
We go through seasons where we would forget about it.
Well, almost. I mean, we're fortunate to have a collaboration with the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and that's the basis for our Red Tide program. From that, we're actually able to leverage additional funding from NOAA, from EPA, and from other areas, and GCOOS, which is the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System. And all that goes into the overall research that we're doing with our research partners.
There seems to be a big technical debate going on whether the freshwater algae from Lake Okeechobee was released earlier that year, if that had any impact. We go back and forth on that as not a cause of red tide, but surely a contributing factor. What are your thoughts on that and clarifying that?
Well, you're right that it's not a cause of red tide. We've had red tide as far back, indications as far back as the 1500s with the Spanish explorers noting in their logs things that look very much like a red tide. But the question is, does that enhance it? Does it make it worse? And that, again, is something that really needs to be looked at. We do know that nutrients coming into the freshwater are the cause of the excessive amount of the cyanobacteria, or the blue-green algae, in the fresh water. We know that when that material comes down the river or out St. Lucie to the other coast, it decomposes and it causes a mess, and it also provides secondary nutrients that could be used by a red tide if it's in the area. But there are a lot of other things that can use those nutrients as well. So again, that's part of our future studies to try to do a much better job of understanding what that relationship is. You might have a correlation of periods when there's really heavy rain. You have nutrients coming from the entire coast, not just Okeechobee, not just the river. And after that, there's a correlation that there is a red tide generally can occur a month or so after that. But a correlation is not a cause and effect, and we have to be careful how we interpret these data. And again, we need a lot more closely related results before we can draw those conclusions.
And that leads me to, I guess, Hurricane Michael didn't wipe it out. So what's that all about? If that's not going to do it, were we hoping?
Well, we weren't really planning on that happening, depending on it. It would have been nice. Hurricane Michael did his part as it came up into the Gulf of Mexico. The anticyclonic movement of circulation caused the winds to blow offshore for at least a week or several days, and that moved the red tide away from the immediate shore, and especially moved the effects of it, because even if you have red tide along the shore, if the winds are blowing offshore, you're not feeling it's there. So, but as Michael passed, the winds switched around and started blowing back onshore. And so as we monitored the coast, we found out that the red tide had come back, but not to the extent that it did before. And right now, it's really low. If people go to the website visitbeaches.org, they can see from 37 beaches along the coast of Florida what the conditions are twice a day. And at this point, the latest I saw, there were several that had no dead fish, no irritation, and others, a few that had slight irritation and some dead fish. Again, that's primarily because the wind's blowing offshore, but also our results are showing that the concentration of the red tide cells have been lowered from what they were a month or so ago.
So we're at the whim of the wind. Whatever the winds, people will go, it's coming from the west, so here we go again. So are we at the mercy of the wind?
To a degree we are, the wind and the circulation patterns in the Gulf, because it becomes patchy.
Exactly. What happens with there were huge fish kills in Sarasota Bay, of course. So what do we know about the long-term impact of this will have on the hatches in the next few years? What's the risk there? That could change that whole cycle.
It certainly could. And one of the things we're concerned about is in Charlotte Harbor, this was the snook spawning season. And so it's going to be, in essence, a very large experiment as we monitor over the next couple of years how the population recovers. We don't really know. We're concerned that it could be a real problem. There were places in Sarasota Bay where the benthic environment, the bottom environment, became totally wiped out. Now that's not always due to just the toxins, because as the fish die and settle to the bottom and decompose, the decomposition, the microorganisms causing the decomposition use up the oxygen. So whole areas of the bottom can become hypoxic, low oxygen, and that makes even some of the rigorous shellfish die as well.
Absolutely. A big question that I ask everybody, if money was no object, what would your top 3 priorities be for MOPE?
Number one, we would have a lot more sensors out in the environment. I like to compare us with the National Weather Service. They're trying to predict the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere and how that interacts with the oceans. They got sensors everywhere, on the water, under the water, in the air, on the land. They're 24/7, and they do a good job of predicting the weather, but not completely. Our ability, even with working with the State Fish and Wildlife, which is a great partnership, we are able to go for a cruise along the coast once one month, and then a cruise offshore once the other month. That is not sufficient to understand what's happening the 30-some days in between. So we need a lot more sensors. Our MOPE Ocean Technology Program has developed some very sophisticated sensors that can identify the presence of the red tide 24/7. They're sitting out here at New Pass and also down in Sanibel area, monitoring that and sending the information back to us. And that's a program in cooperation with the state as well as with GCOOS, which, as I said, is the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System, which is actually kind of a subsidiary of NOAA. That we'd like to have about a dozen of those out there on moorings and other places. And then, of course, we have the glider, the autonomous underwater vehicle that now goes from surface to bottom, back up to surface with sensors in it. And along with the University of South Florida and with the state of Florida Fish and Wildlife, with a team of those, we could really gather a tremendous amount of information to help us understand what happens before there's a bloom, as a bloom is developing, as it's terminating, and then as it goes away. What do we know, and how can we interpret all of those data to our advantage?
Absolutely, and I hope that at some point a lot of people are vying for dollars, and especially now for red tide. So hopefully all these, your top 3 priorities will be line items in budgets soon to come. I want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be talking with you.
Thank you. Another local group that is dedicated to our environment is the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. Since 1989, they have restored wetlands, deployed artificial reef habitat, and built oyster reefs. Water quality in the bay has improved significantly, but thanks to red tide, 2018 was a setback. We talked to Executive Director Marc Elderson about where we go from here. Welcome, Marc. It's great to have you here. Let's start with the big picture. Your tenure as Executive Director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. Before we talk about red tide, talk to me about the good news for our bay.
Well, good news is we've had a large pollution reduction to Sarasota Bay as a result of elimination of wastewater discharge and large stormwater treatment systems that have been put in place across the region to reduce nutrient loadings to the bay. And that has resulted in a 54% increase of seagrasses in Sarasota Bay, which is an indicator of improving water quality and improving health of the system itself.
That's the good news. Now, let's talk about red tide. There's obviously a big technical debate going on about what causes red tide. Some say it's entirely natural phenomenon. It's been here for years, centuries. Some say it's part of pollution and overdevelopment, and some say both. What is your take on this from all your years of experiences on our waters?
I think perhaps a little bit of everybody is right. It's a very complex organism. Red tide can use all sources of nutrient.
Yeah, they say global warming, runoff, Lake Okeechobee. That has been in the news lately. That has been on everybody's lips. Talk to me about that implication of Lake Okeechobee, global warming, agriculture, population. How does that all tie into as being part of the problem?
Well, we had a very wet spring this year and a very heavy rainfall, particularly in the central part of Florida. And Lake Okeechobee doesn't usually fill up until August. This year it filled up in May. And the Corps of Engineers got nervous about flooding out the towns south of Lake Okeechobee, Clewiston, other towns. Folks were in danger, so they opened up the gates and they allowed the water to come down the Closatchee River. That water was very nutrient rich at that particular time. It created cyanobacterium, which is the green slime that you've seen all over the national TV. And then those nutrients became available down in the Gulf of Mexico. The issue is when after the flow reached all the way down past Sanibel and went out into the Gulf, the issue is did the red tide organism use those nutrients? And the answer is open for debate.
So we have compromised our immune system, and where does that lead us? And I think that's the level of discourse, and there's a lot of fear that our immune system is breaking down, and how are we going to deal with that? Those are the realities.
From FWC work, it takes about 12 to 18 months for the system to respond to become fully capable of what it was before. So we're looking at it probably a year and a half from today, if the red tide were to stop today, before the bay is fully responsive again. I think there's pretty much consensus among scientists anyway that we need to engage in as much nutrient control as possible because we as people are nitrogen producers.
Sure.
Basically, we produce nitrogen in everything that we do. And so as we put more people here in our region, then we need to be more sensitive to continuing to control the amount of nutrients getting to our water bodies. And perhaps that will result in some reduction in the intensification of red tide.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's so much money tied in this red tide issue.
Oh my.
Real estate, restaurants, businesses, all these drivers of our economy are really being hurt.
Well, certainly this has a potential of impacting our real estate values. It may have already impacted them depending on how home sales are going throughout this area, particularly in our coastal environments. And I know it's impacted our restaurants and our different types of industries that depend on the water itself, anywhere from sport fishing to selling beach umbrellas on our beaches to going out to dinner. The restaurants are empty in a lot of areas. It's had a major impact on our economy here. How long that'll last, I can't tell you. I think some of it depends on how long the bloom lasts here and whether it's subsiding.
So in your role, do you feel that we as a community need to have face-to-face dialogue with all partners, all people involved in this, and keep this going and not hide it?
I do. And I think that we are all a part of the problem. I'm a part of the problem, you're a part of the problem, and we need to keep a focus on this for the future development of Southwest Florida here and our economy. You know, we have to be careful on how we fertilize, we have to be careful on how we landscape and how we keep our grass and how we fertilize our grass and how we water it. There's just a lot of things that we can do from a personal basis to help make things better.
The impact of red tide on local business has also been devastating. Our tourist-centric economy relies on beautiful beaches, good fishing, and great weather. Visit Sarasota County is responsible for marketing our brand.
Well, we at Visit Sarasota County have a crisis communications plan in place. But in a situation like red tide, where the county still very much has businesses that are open and very much has visitors looking for things to see and do, we have never halted our advertising. Instead, we just really shifted our message.
About the red tide message, if you're saying all clear, come on down, and you're working with the restaurateurs, hotels, so forth and so on, how do we make a promise that we can't forecast that red tide may be back?
We don't consider ourselves to be subject matter experts in red tide. We consider ourselves to be subject matter experts on things to see and do in Sarasota County. Right. And from our funding, we do fund the Moat Beach Conditions Report. From an administrative office side, the calls that we're receiving from our partners, we are listening to them. For example, one of the things that we're getting ready to roll out are some marketing grants in response to red tide relief, and our partners telling us that they need some help just marketing their business because they feel like they're seeing a decline in people coming. So we're hoping to roll that out in November, and our whole goal in rolling that out is to make the process very quick and easy.
I've heard talk about drones and having drones come out. Is there funding for drones and kayaking out there, looking for way out there, looking for the source? Is that something that's part of the marketing? I think I read that somewhere.
Well, what a great segue, because one of the Visit Florida grants that we had applied for and received is a Google Map program. Google Map and live pictures is a very organic and authentic way to show what the county looks like.
That's wonderful, and I want to thank you very much. It sounds like a lot of people are going to be on board with that, and Visit Sarasota County is on board with this in state of the art. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you.
Our next guest has strong feelings about red tide. A native Floridian, he owns 3 waterfront restaurants, co-founded a world-renowned fish company, and is a passionate advocate for solutions to avoid red tide. Well, welcome. We're here on beautiful Anna Maria Island. Absolutely gorgeous here today. We're here with Edie Giles, local entrepreneur, public servant, person who's involved in the community. And we're here to talk about red tide. I've been involved in the community for many, many years. What has this season of red tide done? What's going on here, and what do you see happening?
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and welcome to paradise.
Yes,
It's a beautiful day, as you can see. We're lucky. The water's in great shape today, and we've really had a very tough 6 weeks, though, from when it arrived here, as it moved up the coast from the south, about the middle of August. For the next 5 or 6 weeks, it was one of the more severe outbreaks of red tide that we've seen. I've been raised on this beach. We lived in Lakeland, but we always came here. I don't ever remember a time when I wasn't, you know, Anna Maria wasn't part of my life, and so I've seen red tides come and go. I remember the 95, 96 outbreak because we had just started the beach house, and that had a long duration to it. But, you know, what we're seeing now, I think, is people understanding that we now need to take action. That the days of saying, oh, it's a natural organism and, you know, and it comes and goes, well, there's no question that red tide is a natural organism, but there is also absolutely no question what feeds red tide. And we can, and we now must coalesce, come together to demand action from the policymakers on a broad spectrum, whether it's Lake Okeechobee, which is a very large concern. That can be done, and it can be done right. We have to demand that it be done right. Since this outbreak, because of the concern that was voiced loudly by the citizens of the southwest coast and the southeast coast, you know, this isn't just about us on this coast. They've been dealing with other harmful algal bloom issues over there, with the green slime over there. And so people now are demanding action. Senator Rubio and Senator Nelson have passed a bill in a record amount of time, come together across the aisle, broad support. I think it passed by 99 votes in the Senate. It's on the president's desk to finally do a major projects for marshes to clean water under Okeechobee. This is a great first step. Make no mistake about it, it is not enough there. It's got to be augmented. It is going to have to be larger than what they've proposed, but I congratulate them for it. People need to know that they did that, and it's a great first step. But we've got to deal with Okeechobee in a number of ways. And we've got to deal with the water treatment plants where they have outflow problems. And for God's sakes, the idea that we are not monitoring septic tanks in the state of Florida and that we are allowing that is ridiculous. And we've got to get serious, and we've got to demand action on stormwater issues. And we've all got to take a part, and we've all got to own part of this. And we've all got to do our part in our own yards, so that what we're putting on our yards, what we're putting on local farms, what we're putting on commercial landscaping is not detrimental to our environment. This island that we're on has done remarkable things in terms of how we have dealt with stormwater. We are one of the most progressive areas that I think along the coast of Florida, because now you have to, when you put a house on the island now, in all 3 island cities on Anna Maria Island, you've got to dig that lot out, you've got to put the equivalent of French drains in, so we don't have runoff into the bays, so we don't have runoff into the Gulf. So we've got to do all of those things. We've got to do aquaculture. You know, we have this unique place that we are so fortunate to live in. And let's face it, we're the stewards of this.
Right. And your aquaculture business, how is that going to have to change? How is the management of that going to change along with everything else?
Well, you know, we have an opportunity here because we're the only place in the country that has 3 national estuaries on its border. Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, and Charlotte Harbor. And we are the best place in the world to raise bivalves. And guess what? Bivalves are part of the solution, because clams, which is what does so well in this area. We got 287,000 acres of shellfish approved waters in the state of Florida. We need aquaculture to feed people, but aquaculture cleans water. Out of that 287,000 acres, only 1% are leased. Every clam that we put in the water here under aquaculture now will clean 40 to 50 gallons of seawater a day. And it will promote the benthic environment. It will grow more seagrass. All of that contributes to cleaning up water. So we've got to do a whole broad spectrum of things so that we're making sure that we are doing our part to not feed a naturally occurring organism, to not be having to worry about we're at a tipping point.
Right.
You know, this thing comes, we feed it, it keeps
Right.
going. Nobody wants to look into that abyss.
No,
you know.
no. You are feeding the beast here. What is it going to take to have everybody get together on this? There are people that would not interview with me because, you know, I don't want to bring attention to it. If we continue, there are folks that want to hide in the sand, you know.
Well, I think we just have to be honest about what's going on here, okay? And I know the folks that, you know, I sit on the Tourist Development Council board,
Right.
and we're all about putting out accurate information to folks. You know, the Tourist Development Council's board's job is not to go out and, you know, talk about red tide, so you can certainly understand that.
But could they put a line item in the tourist development budget for red tide?
No, because they spend the dollars that come from the tourist tax on advertising and that, but
Well-
what they can do and what they are doing is gearing up to say, okay, you know, we are going to, when red tide is over, and we're going to be able to then go out and promote our beaches and help our businesses
Sure.
and all this whole local economy. Look, the whole economy of the west coast of Florida, and
Yeah.
the east coast of Florida is built on its beaches.
Sure.
So
Sure.
you know, we've got to make sure we're doing our part. And people have got to coalesce. Where they can start is start1.org, okay? S-T-A-R-T,
Yeah.
the numeral 1,
Right.
.org. That is Solutions to Avoid Red Tide that we started after the 95 and 96 outbreak. It was local people coming together to work on control and mitigation. And that is somewhere people can go, and we will find out from there, where are we going to be going, what's the name of the organization, how
Yes.
do we bring all of these people together to demand action. But if you want to be involved, then every single organization that is on the west coast and the east coast of Florida, I think, is going to be very concerned. I don't care if it's a homeowners association,
Yeah.
a chamber of commerce, a realtors board, a business association, an environmental concern, fishing concerns, recreation concerns, all of that. I think if we demand action, the policy makers will listen and they will do the right thing here. We need to support them doing the right thing.
Absolutely, and I think that's what it's going to take, because this is a new paradigm. You talk about the last outbreak, 95, and you started this group. This is an opportunity when you have the blueprint of it for people to get on board. People want to know, where do I sign up to really effectively make a decision? I sit on the board of this, I sit on the board of...
Right.
When do we all get together and this is it?
Right. Well, I think we need to use this time when people are so concerned
Yeah.
to not lose this opportunity while people really are ready to do something about it. And I intend to be working on that in whatever
I see.
fashion I can find that is the best way to support that effort. And right now, we can start with start1.org, and we'll see where we go from there in terms of mobilizing folks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The time is right for all this. Thank you so much, Ed Giles.
Thank
It
you
was
for
great.
your interest, and come out and support all the businesses and the folks out here on our beaches.
Absolutely.
It's important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne.
If you would like to support the war against red tide, you can contact any of the organizations that appeared in this program. Start1.org for solutions to avoid red tide, moat.org for Moat Marine Laboratory, and SarasotaBay.org for the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. Hope you learned something from our program. Yes, red tide is a natural organism, but man-made pollutants are feeding the problem. Hopefully, this year was a wake-up call to action for all of us. Remember, you can watch this show and all our previous shows on Facebook, YouTube, and my website, SuzanneAtwell.org. Well, that wraps up another show. Thanks for watching. I'm Suzanne Atwell, and as always, we'll see you around town.